Hi everyone, welcome back to part 2 of our chat under the Leeds Digital Festival event umbrella. So I'm Joe Ellis and I'm going to take you through the second part of this talk, which is from outputs to outcomes. That's me. I'm a product analyst at Digital. I've been at And for about 6 months, and most of that time working with Sammy actually as part of the MKM team. I've played mostly a business analyst role on that team, as well as sort of a stand-in product owner every now and again when Sammy's not been around. And typically that's what we do as product analysts at And. We're generally playing the roles of business analyst or product owner, and then trying to sort of augment that with sort of agile and product management best practices around those roles from our experiences. Prior to And Digital, I was a product manager at Sky Betting and Gaming for a bit longer than 3 years. I worked in the free-to-play games team, so had a lot of experience throughout the product lifecycle, from new free-to-play games that we launched in international territories to sort of the other end of the scale, highly mature products like Super 6 and Sporting Life that see huge volumes of users on a weekly basis that we wanted to kind of eke out incremental value from. So it's from this breadth of experience that I'll draw a lot of my thoughts from. Before Sky Betting and Gaming, I was a product manager for 3 years at Betfred Digital in sports betting product management. Hence the sort of relationship then to Sky Betting and Gaming. So first of all, I just want to kind of introduce the topic that I want to talk about and explain a bit why it's still a necessary topic to talk about. And then we'll move on to looking at, well, what can we actually do about some of the challenges that are presented along the lines of this topic. What do experts say? What tools and techniques do I suggest you could explore? And what have I tried, and with what success? And then we'll wrap up, and like Jess and Chris and Sammy and everybody else you've heard from And on this call have said, there'll be 5 minutes or so for Q&A at the end. So save your questions for then if you can. I'll put them in the chat in the meantime. So what is meant by outputs and outcomes as words? What's the difference and why does it matter? They're often used interchangeably, but they are not at all interchangeable. They are not synonymous. And I'd go so far as to argue that the difference between them is often the difference between a successful product team and an unsuccessful one. I'm an English graduate, so I'm a language pedant by trade, and it's a badge of honor that I wear very proudly. So if you use less when you really mean fewer in my presence, then rest assured I will let you know about that. I think that words and their meaning are thrown around much too frivolously these days. Anyone who's been sort of called a legend for any kind of trivial activity that they might have undergone, or actually been a little bit offended in the name of banter, then you probably get the gist of this point. And I think this blurring of definitions can play out in the workplace a lot as well, when we talk about things like outputs and outcomes and targets and goals and all those kinds of things, where everything kind of starts to mean the same thing, or at least people perceive those things to all be the same. And so when everything becomes sort of ambiguous, then it's much harder to communicate what is actually important to the business. So that's why this distinction is so necessary to appreciate, because it gives us a language that's going to help us stay rooted in what matters for our teams and for our organizations. So the output is the stuff that we produce. It's the piece of functionality, the feature, the product, the thing that is the result of, in this context, our development effort. Whereas the outcome is the difference it makes. It's that higher order consequence of the output. It's the change in behavior that the output provokes. Or put a different way, an outcome is a change in human behavior that creates value. value is an interesting word in this quotation, because in this context, I think it's quite clear that the sort of the meaning of value there is value for our product and for our business. But the way that we achieve that value has to be symbiotic. It has to be by creating value for the user as well. Because how can we expect to change their behavior if what we offer them to change their behavior with is worthless? We're not going to be successful. And in many ways, that is the art of product management to me, satisfying user needs in a way that creates commercial value. Businesses are commercial entities, and so what we often see is a bit of tension between commercial colleagues of an organization and product colleagues, and even more so when product development efforts aren't moving commercial needles. So take a typical product roadmap for, let's say, a given online content platform. And it might look something like this. So we've got some strategic themes that are going to govern our focus a little bit throughout this time period. We've got some features in there that feel like really valuable features that are going to very much add to the experience of our content platform. We've even got that credit card camera recognition in there, which should really help out our monetization efforts. So those commercial bots should be absolutely buzzing with that, should keep them off our back for a bit. But by our previous definitions, we can see that all we're describing here are outputs. The strategic themes, the features, we're just describing outputs. They're stuff that we're going to make. They don't describe anything about the value that's going to be created as a result of some change in user behavior. So before I move on, just to caveat slightly, there's nothing inherently bad about a roadmap full of outputs. In fact, it's going to be quite necessary because not many organizations will fully empower any team to just own an outcome and not require some reassurance of that tangible way that they're going to actually do it. Not to mention, it will be quite hard to coordinate with other business functions like marketing if you're giving them nothing tangible to go on. But the problem is, and the point of this talk revolves around, we can have a bit of a tendency to get bogged down in the detail and the planning of these outputs to the detriment of achieving the overall outcome. And so the roadmap as an artifact is often the very embodiment of this problem. Our outcomes aren't present here. It's just a series of outputs disconnected from their purpose a lot of the time. Because ultimately, what if the thing that our business cares about this year is revenue growth? Because we've invested a load of money in our teams and our tech. We want to see a return on that. Or what if our key commercial stakeholder wants to see our product pull its weight on sign-up conversion, for example? Maybe we launched a feature 3 months ago and there are some UX or usability problems with that feature and we want to improve the adoption of it. You can start to see, hopefully, that even though we've got our strategic themes in our roadmap that are supposed to give us a bit of a sense of safety, security, that we're on the right path, in each of these examples, these 3 examples I just mentioned, our outputs on that roadmap are severely disconnected from what the organization cares about at that time. Now, obviously, I have built this example in a way that highlights that point. And I completely accept that this won't always be the case. But again, my point is that it is often the case. And even if you start out with the best of intentions, with a clear mapping between outcomes and your outputs, then even if you start in that way, the importance of that connection can often just become a bit lost and a bit degraded over time in the pressure that sort of a fast-paced, demanding organization creates, which ultimately are typical of where a lot of us are going to be working. So we often end up here. And what we need to explore is, why do these chasms of sadness occur? And how can we bridge the chasms of sadness and ensure that we're always working in a way that keeps our outputs and our outcomes intrinsically aligned? How we bridge the chasm of sadness comes later on. But for now, I'm going to dig a little bit into why we might lose touch with our outcomes. Well, sometimes the outcomes you should be prioritizing, maybe they're just not clear from the business, particularly if the business doesn't have a solid strategy in place, everything that Sammy spoke about in the previous half an hour. Maybe you just don't know how to stimulate those outcomes. And so under the pressure of being asked for your roadmap, you might just cram some stuff in there that feels like it should work, and you sort of cross your fingers and deal with it, deal with it in the coming weeks, problem for future me sort of thing. Another reason is that it's just really quite hard to make material upticks in outcomes that matter. And it often takes time. So if you're in an organization that is culturally established to equate delivery with value, then that's a pretty tough spot, because the likelihood is you're in this vicious cycle of roadmap after roadmap that have become very distant from the underlying outcomes that really matter because of this cultural trait of delivery at all costs, because delivery is equated with value. Whatever the reason might be, when our products fail to move the needle on the metrics that matter, it becomes very difficult as a product manager to get continued investment and buy-in and support for everything that you want to do. And when those sort of fractures start to happen, then it all gets very disheartening. And that tension that we spoke about between commercial and product starts to show its more negative side. But that tension can be harnessed positively as well, if we take an ongoing outcome-centric approach to how we work as product professionals. To some of you, I'm sure you're probably thinking, that seems quite obvious. That seems pretty, yep, just spent 15 minutes telling me how to suck eggs. So my question then would be, well, why is this topic still necessary to talk about? Why do we still have books being published on this topic? Why are there still more Medium articles and tweets than you can shake a stick at talking about it? Ultimately, managing by outcomes rather than outputs, it has been a topic for ages. And it's been repopularized by Google's use of OKRs, which stands for Objectives and Key Results, if you're not aware. But OKRs as a framework predates Google as well. So why do we still need to talk about this stuff? And I think the point of why this is still a valid debate to be having, or rather a valid topic to be pursuing, is that it's one thing to know this concept academically. Like, it's one thing just to know that, yep, outcomes, that's more sensible to prioritize our time around than outputs. But it's another thing entirely for the individual product manager to put into practice in their organization in a practical, effective way that sticks. Some organizations might have very switched on management who are savvy to these ideas, and they're willing to lead with new methods of management and support their people through it. And that's great. But many product professionals find themselves between the rock and the hard place, whereby the rock is that idea you need to remain functional in your organization, you need to do your job still. And the hard place, which is, despite doing your job, you realize you're not really doing it in the best way that you could be, and your team aren't working quite how as effectively as they could be. And so many attempts to make some progress on this point might look a little bit like this, where you've just watched this tremendous talk by this fellow Joe from Leeds Digital, all about outcomes, and going to work on Monday, and you say, team, we should manage by outcomes rather than outputs. And you get some general murmurings of assent. Some people seem like they agree. And you say, sweet, let's come up with some OKRs then that we can govern ourselves by. A few days sort of passes and you're trying to implement some of this stuff, and you start to hear things like, do you know what, we're just a bit too busy for something new right now. Team are saying things like, well, it's not really how management want us to be working, is it? And there's nothing really wrong with how we're working. And nobody else here is working like this, and we don't really get it anyway, and other such excuses start to flood in. And so the enlightened product manager ends up just a bit frustrated, a bit disillusioned. I'm sure many of us have experienced those sort of less open-minded, less open to change organizations. So I'm sure you recognize that turning up one day and simply saying, hey, we should manage by outcomes, not outputs. Do you know that? Or, we should use some OKRs. Turning up one day and saying those things is completely ineffective against the systemic level of habit that is baked into that organization over the years, decades that it's been operating. And ultimately, if the whole organization is to change its way of working, then a top-down cultural shift in thinking is going to be needed. Because the way that you charter work creates culture. And if you ask people to build features, then they will. And they'll value the delivery of those features, even if delivery doesn't create big picture success. They'll value the traits and the behaviors that make it possible to deliver features. On the other hand, if you ask people to be responsible for success, you're asking them to work in a new way. And although eventually this approach will shape a new culture, that cultural transition needs to be made consciously, and new cultural traits need to be developed and supported. Now, some people might be exceptionally good at influencing and at leadership, and they're these people that can just sort of spark a top-down widespread change all by themselves. It's great for them. I'm sure plenty of us have come across people like this in our careers. And like I say, it's very useful if that's the kind of person that you are, but I'd argue that it's not really most of us. Most of us aren't like this. So what if you're part of an organization that is, at its current time in history, resistant to any real systemic change about how they're working? Either consciously, the organization just rejects the change that is suggested, or subconsciously, they don't even realize they're behind the curve. Well, it doesn't really matter, because we need to do something. So what can we do? What can the most of us do? How can we help develop and support the new ways, the new approach that the previous slide refers to? How can we help to enact the paradigm shift that digital businesses in 2020 fundamentally need to embrace to be successful? Well, you can give up. You could give up and sack this off completely and just fall in line with the old habits, because change is hard. So you can just think really hard and identify some features and plot them on a timeline, call it your roadmap. Fine, like, if that sounds good for you, then thanks very much for coming. Clearly, this has been a very compelling 20 minutes or so for you. Another approach might be to go completely off-piste. Go completely off-piste and rogue and insist that people adopt your new ideas, and just hope that that works as a mad genius role, just shouting from the rooftops about all these new ideas. That's fine. That's, quite high risk if you want to take that angle. So is there a more balanced approach, one that's a bit more effective at simply leading by example from your product team? I argue there is. So it starts with nurturing a problem focus in how you work and how your teams work. It goes into the value of showing your work and the value of visualizing that work. We're going to kick off with the problem focus. Product teams should stop prioritizing solutions and instead prioritize opportunities. Opportunities are customer needs, pain points, desires, wants, chances for us to intervene in a way that makes our customers' lives better. So by prioritizing opportunities or problem statements, which are a tool that is going to articulate an opportunity, then the effort of you and your team remains firmly focused on driving real positive change for the user. And that's the biggest lever to achieving outcomes. So how do we become more problem or opportunity focused? Well, first thing I encourage you to do is to get clarity. Make sure that the outcomes that your organization is going to judge the success or failure of your product on are expressed with clarity. Now, there aren't really inherently good or bad outcomes, because it's up to the business to decide what the good outcomes are for it at a given time. But there are well-articulated and poorly articulated outcomes. So make sure you understand and are clear on what you're being measured on. Because just like any target, an outcome should be somewhat SMART, to borrow the acronym. So specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, timely. So if you're working under an outcome of sort out conversion, then that's probably going to be quite difficult because it isn't timely. We don't know if it's achievable. All the rest of it, we don't know if it's realistic. However, improve conversion by 5 percentage points from current baseline in Q1. Now we do know whether this feels achievable and realistic. We know that we can measure it because it's clarified in the outcome. And it's overall going to be an outcome that we can achieve or we don't achieve. It's not just ploughing along in this kind of grey area of uncertainty that the previous outcome would have encouraged. So if you're given woolly outcomes, then push back, insist on a bit more specificity if you need to. And if you aren't given any guidance at all on your success metrics, then don't be afraid to potentially define them for yourself and validate those back with your management and your stakeholders. Ultimately, you cannot set yourself up for success if you don't know what success actually looks like. So once you've done that, you can understand the current state of play a little bit for your product. You can audit your product against those metrics and outcomes that you now know it needs to deliver against. By auditing your product, you're going to establish a bit of a baseline that's going to tell you whether you're moving in the right direction or not. And you should communicate this. Make sure your team and your stakeholders know what this current state of play is, know from where are we originating from on this journey. And having audited your product, you should be able to get a sense of where your biggest gaps are between what's going on right now and where you need to be. And you can express these gaps as problem statements. So what is the problem statement? Well, it's a formulaic template, quite straightforward, which just objectively defines your problem, hypothesizes about the opportunity that exists, and makes you define some success criteria to know when the problem has been solved. So what this does is it deliberately keeps us away from the world of solutions and outputs before we're ready. It encourages us and our teams to explore that problem properly and always stay rooted in the eventual solving of it, which, as we know, is the thing that's most intrinsically tied to the outcomes that matter to the organization. If you can, I'd encourage you to reflect these problem statements in whichever way you feel suitable on your roadmap. There are lots of different templates and methods for producing an outcome-based roadmap. Obviously, the internet is your friend on that point. So if that's where you are currently in your team, on your sort of product management journey, you're ready for an outcome-based roadmap, then I encourage you to kind of look that up, basically, because this talk is much more about the process to getting to the point where an outcome-based roadmap is necessary. If you haven't got all this in place, then you're sort of doing it at the wrong time, I would argue. Finally, I encourage you to prioritize and explore as a team. So this is going to encourage shared buy-in as much of the process as of the results. And it's that buy-in to the process of what we're doing that is, in my view, the more important angle here. Some people won't want to be quite so involved with exploring these problems, and that's fine. But the idea is that you give those who do want to be involved the opportunity to. And when you do so, when you do explore these problem statements, make sure you're outlining the business outcomes that you're ultimately trying to achieve, the product problems that you currently face in your world, and the user needs that you believe your product fulfills or will aim to fulfill, and therefore the opportunities underneath all of that exist. In every kind of ideation or sketching session in my last role, The product designer aligned to my team would say, without fail, in every one of these sessions, everyone is a designer, encouraging absolutely everybody to pick up a pen and just draw whatever ideas that they've got. Because ultimately, diversity is a massive asset when it comes to ideation and workshopping. You don't have to have designer in your job title to pick up a pen and give us your ideas. And that's where the best ideas are going to come from, that breadth of input, that diversity. These are some techniques you can use to explore problems or to remain problem or opportunity focused. You can reframe your opportunities as how might we statements. And a how might we statement is essentially a boiled down problem statement. It's to the same purpose of keeping your thinking geared around the opportunity rather than jumping into a solution or an output. There's impact mapping. I'm sure some of you will be familiar with that, a very powerful tool, especially if you're co-creating your impact map with some of your key stakeholders and keeping it as a living document. It's a really useful tool. Opportunity solution tree, that's similar to an impact map, and again, has that same purpose. All of these things, so much information on the internet that will do a far better job of explaining than I will in a couple of minutes here. So please look them up if you're interested. Finally, a problem backlog. That's a bit more experimental. I'll explain briefly what I mean by a problem backlog just now. And it's not Jay-Z's to-do list. It is a companion to your product backlog. So in the same way that we keep a product backlog, which is prioritized with the best understood, highest value items at the top, we can keep a companion problem backlog, where similarly our biggest opportunities are at the top that we're currently exploring or are next to explore. Those problems are done once we've addressed that problem to the measure that we've articulated in the problem statement. Just as with the product backlog, the problem backlog can be reprioritized, but there should be some level of synchronization, because if you're reprioritizing the problems to solve at the moment, then that should be impacting what's currently prioritized to build in your product backlog. The main thing the problem backlog, I think, does is encourages the product team to grasp ownership of how to solve the problem. So whether it's by building solution A or B or C, or whatever solution it might be, the point is that we start to make the team feel accountable for outcomes, for solving these problems, rather than simply for shipping the predefined feature and moving on to the next one. That's a good direction to be heading in. Secondly, showing your work. So much like in school, in your exams and things like that, where you needed to show your workings to get full marks, it's a similar concept. Not that anyone's going to be marking your product roadmap, but you get the idea. And the key point about showing your work is to improve stakeholder engagement ultimately. So when you show a feature roadmap to your stakeholders, their only option is to agree or disagree with your route. So what we want to do is kind of remove some of the resistance that can crop up when we're trying some new ideas and new ways of working, and allow us to have better and more productive conversations with our stakeholders about our plans. We often end up creating a bit of a stakeholder problem for ourselves when all we show them is a roadmap with a bunch of outputs. Because as this quotation says, all we can have then is a conversation of opinions about solution A, as opposed to a twist on solution A that key stakeholder has thought up. So showing your work is going to help support your roadmap firstly. And it's going to add credibility to your roadmap. It's going to serve as sort of an ongoing checkpoint to validate your progress and your thinking, like a continuous sense check. And that point about getting away from output-driven discussion is another big one. It's going to help you have much more productive discussions about the right things that should be debated. And yeah, it's going to help you have better stakeholder conversations. So showing your work and having processes that allow you to do this are going to make it much easier to bring your stakeholders on side. and easier to remove resistance that might be present when we want to try some new processes and new ways of working, like I've said. I think it's easy to fall into the trap of when you get asked for your roadmap or your plans, you just fire off an email with said roadmap document attached and you move on to the next thing. I really would encourage, where suitable with the right stakeholders, that it's much more preferable to set up a face-to-face discussion that's going to give you the chance to talk through some of this supporting material, some of your ways of working that you think are going to be more productive towards the outcomes that these stakeholders care about. If you get that FaceTime with your main stakeholder or main couple of stakeholders, you can really show them and tell the story about how their outcome is front and center of your plans. And if they're not quite sure, if you've got some stakeholders that don't quite know what they want, then you can find out what's really important to them in a bit of a chat like this. And what you can do is potentially agree something of a micro outcome with them that maybe you can find some capacity to work on for them just over the period of a few weeks to prove out some of these new ways of working, these concepts to them that are going to get them on board for wider change, for rolling out some of this stuff more widely. Obviously, you need to exercise your own judgment about which stakeholders you do this with. You don't just want to do it with all and sundry, just the one or two that are particularly influential in your product area. And the point is to have a bit of an arsenal of resources that you can lean on to really bring your stakeholders on side, rather than just always relying on your roadmap. So you can show whatever's appropriate, whatever techniques you've used in becoming more outcome-centric. Take those artifacts and have them as part of your, like I say, kind of arsenal of resources that you can lean on. Could be anything, could be any of these things and more, based on whatever you felt suitable and resonates for you, that's helping you stay, as I say, outcome-centric. And these things are going to help you to kind of frame and lead discussions and sessions that you have with these people. If you've got this supporting material, it becomes so much easier to keep those sessions headed in the right direction. Obviously, our wider stakeholders have their own lives and their own responsibilities, so they're not always going to be able to engage with us on this kind of thing at the level and frequency that we sometimes want them to. But the point is, by doing this stuff, by investing in the time to capture and show your work, then it's going to be much easier to get them on side when they do have a bit of time to get involved. Lastly, visualize. The further we are from the results of our decisions, the easier it is to keep our current views rather than update them. I think you can extend this quotation by saying, the further we are from clear sight of our methods, the easier it is to keep them rather than challenge them. I think the adage, out of sight, out of mind, is poor practice's best friend. So hold yourself and your team's practices accountable by visualizing what's going on. We want to make it clear and obvious to everyone what the link is between the tactical things that we're working on, those features, those tickets going through the board, and the ultimate point of why we're building those things. We want to make that link as clear as we can. And once you do, it's going to give sort of our team, our stakeholders, a bit of a much better reference point for all of our discussions. And it's going to invite them to think about their work, their ideas in this same way that intrinsically connects idea to outcome. So think about how you can set up an information radiator of sorts. How can you illustrate what big picture success for your product looks like? And then how what you're working on right now is moving you towards that success. And you can do this in all sorts of ways, to greater or lesser extents, however it suits your workplace and your product. But by doing this, other teams are going to be hopefully encouraged to up their game a little bit. Other product managers might start conversations with you about thoughts that they've had, things that they've tried, and hopefully just create a much more sort of productive environment for your team. Got some examples coming up in a second. And just about anything can be used to show more information about you and your team's work towards achieving outcomes. Everyone's generally very good at visualizing their sprint board or their scrum board, whatever it might be, but don't stop there. Obviously exercise a bit of judgment. Don't just stick anything up willy-nilly and turn your workspace into a primary school classroom. Make sure you're choosing in how and what you visualize. Make sure you tell the story of how this stuff is linking back into the bigger picture. Over communication is very rarely a bad thing. So visualizing your methods is contributing to how you're communicating back to the organization. And lastly, get creative, because there's really no end to how you can visualize. Like I said, this point isn't about the art of visualization per se, more about what you're visualizing. But nonetheless, you can get as creative as you want on this point within the sort of boundaries of your workspace. I've seen stuff hung from ceilings. I've seen communal iPads that teams invite passers-by to come and beta test a feature on. All sorts of things. So I understand not everybody's going to be able to do this. But if you do have the creative license in your office, then I really encourage you to make the most of it. So this is an example from recent history of an attempt to visualize a bit product strategy for Sporting Life. And it works sort of top down. The image is a bit too small really to see properly. So to annotate it, at the very top, we've got the vision for that, in this case, for that financial year. As per Sammy's talk earlier on, your vision often is going to be even broader than that in time terms. We were working under a vision for this particular financial year. And we distilled areas of focus from that vision that have a commercial leaning slightly, but give us some guardrails for where to focus our attention. And that enabled us to articulate some problem statements. And those problem statements you can see are reviewed every quarter. So we're not kidding ourselves that we know everything we need to know up front. We're embracing the fact that things change, strategic priorities change, user behavior, our products, businesses, they change, they're dynamic. We've got some long-term product objectives. So like I mentioned about the areas of focus having more of a commercial sort of angle, the product objectives allowed us to express our intentions from more of a user point of view, from a product tech design perspective. So then when it came to digging into the next problem statement and ideating around that problem, we could do so aware of the balance that we need to strike between the commercial areas of focus and some best practices about what a technology product needs to be in 2020 that the long-term product objectives articulate. We have just a 3-month view of the roadmap, just at epic level, pretty high level. And that 3-month view is just forcing us to make sure we're regularly reviewing our priorities and checking our direction, basically. In the sort of mini Kanban board in the bottom left, the done column features an iterate, leave, and a bin section. So every piece of work that goes through that board and goes live is consciously iterated upon, or because we might still believe in the idea, but it's just not quite been executed right, or it's not quite showing the sort of traction that we might have expected. And we iterate upon that. Or we leave that thing live. So maybe it is performing all right at the moment, and we're going to keep that live for now and monitor it. Or we're going to bin it because actually we've realized that was a bit of a naff idea that missed the mark a little bit. And that just isn't worth any time to iterate upon. Might not even leave it live, should probably be at least switching it off, removing it from the code base if we can. There's also a section for ideas in the bottom right. So you can see those are discussed at 11 a.m. on Tuesday. So anybody walking past can stick an idea on there and come back at 11 o'clock on Tuesday, where as a team, we stand around the board and discuss those new ideas. There's also the unprioritized backlog on the far right. So we're open and honest about what isn't a priority right now, what's not going to happen. This is another example. This is more of an attempt to visualize the discovery efforts of a team. So this is trying to illustrate quite literally the blueprint of how experiments and prototypes have been arrived at. And what I think, I won't go through this one in entirety. There's obviously a lot there. But you can, I think, see how, if you were just walking past that, your interest would be piqued a little bit. You would be thinking, what's going on here? And as soon as you start to look, you realize, you might not consciously realize, they're being very outcome centric, but you can see that that's what they're trying to do. They've got the key facts, the business priorities, the how might we statements. And that is the information that seeds all of the creativity that spills out towards the right. I think if you make visualized resources part of your source of truth for your work, then it's a really valuable thing, because when people come to you with questions, you can take them to those visualized resources and explain the answer in a more effective way than if somebody's come to you with a question about why you're doing something and it's in some document buried in your laptop and it takes 5 minutes to find it, and then the person doesn't care anymore after that 5 minutes, that sort of thing. Everything you need, if it's visualized in this way, everything or most stuff you're going to need to refer to in conversation is just a gesture away, rather than, like I say, buried away in technology. And so wrapping up, hopefully over this last half an hour or so, it's become very clear that outcomes are the measurable impact that we want to achieve, and that outputs are the means for doing that. I hope you feel compelled to invest in a strong workflow, a strong set of practices between how you get to those outcomes from your outputs, or rather how you come up with those outputs in the first place. I hope I've encouraged you to make sure that your desired outcomes are crystal clear. And don't be shy about proving some of these new ideas in a certain way with a key stakeholder if you've got a relationship there that you could lean on. And finally, don't get disheartened, because real change is pretty hard to effect. It takes time and it takes commitment. So all you can do is put your faith in these ideas and commit to them, and trust that over time you'll see results that will generate the traction that you need. Thanks for listening. So we'll go into some Q&As now, and we'll take those from the chat.